Welcome everybody to our webinar today. As Vicki said, it's risk management in medical device design and development. By way of introduction, let me start by saying really that the globalization of the medical device marketplace combined with the growth of medical device usage has really led to a significant increase in the complexity of making a medical device safe for human use and able to function to its design purpose. The one key process mandated by law really to ensure medical device safety and efficacy is risk analysis. Risk analysis is important for designing any product in any industry, but particularly in the design and manufacture of medical devices. Now, this webinar is an overview and will pertain to how risk analysis is applied in the U.S. Now, we only have about an hour to cover the key parts of a very large and involved subject area. Now, as Vicki indicated, at the end of this webinar, we'll have a Q&A session, and I'll certainly try to answer all of your questions, but if I can't, just simply leave me your contact information, and I or one of my staff will get back to you with an answer. Now, you see in front of you the topics that we're going to discuss today. We're going to review the entire process for executing and managing medical device risk analysis. We're going to begin with some basic definitions and end with a discussion of risk control and mitigation. Now, to set the stage, medical devices developed for human applications are used for diagnostic or treatment purposes. They may either be an instrument, an apparatus, or a material. These devices can also be used for daily patient care as well as for medical scientific purposes. Now, researchers charged with the development of new medical devices are faced with the complex task of making their devices safe for human use. Now, risk management involves the identification, understanding, control, and failure prevention of the hazards that result when people use medical devices. Risk analysis plays a key role in the development of a medical device. Risk analysis is a structured tool for the evaluation of potential problems which could be encountered in connection with the use of taking a drug or using a medical device or instrument. Manufacturers are really expected to identify possible hazards associated with their medical device design under both normal and fault conditions. Now, during the process, if any risk is judged unacceptable, that risk must be reduced to acceptable levels by appropriate means. Now, let's begin by defining some key terms. Risk analysis, which is a part of risk management, is a structured tool for the evaluation of potential problems which could be encountered using a medical device. It's a process of objectively assessing, mitigating, and documenting a product's risks. Now, the ISO document 14971, which provides guidance for medical device risk management, defines risk as a combination of the probability of occurrence of harm and the severity of that harm. Now, the best definition for risk management for medical devices is that risk management is the systematic application of management policies, procedures, and practices to the tasks of analyzing, evaluating, monitoring, and controlling risk. Now, what you see here is the simplistic medical device design control model that's provided and presented in the FDA's quality system regulation that the FDA uses to assure design coverage and compliance to their regulation. Now, essentially, all of the global medical device regulations indicate that the manufacturer must apply the process of risk management from a device's initial conception until the device is decommissioned and disposed of. Pretty much everybody agrees with this. And what we're talking about is essentially applying risk management throughout the device's entire life cycle. Now, to continue our definitions, a hazard is a situation that poses a level of threat to life, health, or the environment. Now, there are three types of hazards as they relate to medical devices. They include the inherent risk of the medical treatment itself, device failures, which are malfunctions, and device use. Now, those hazards impact patients, family members, and professional healthcare providers, with certainly the emphasis being on patients. Now, in general, risk analysis or hazard analysis is a tool for the evaluation of potential problems which could be encountered in connection with any number of things, from driving a car, riding on public transportation, taking a drug, or using a medical device. We live in a world full of risks with varying likelihoods and consequences. It's really quite simple in terms of why we do risk analysis. We do it to make sure our devices are safe, that any device that does reach the marketplace is quickly identified and corrected to demonstrate to regulatory bodies that we only manufacture safe devices and to minimize our exposure. Finally, it's just really the right thing to do. Now, one important fact that I came across recently that I just wanted to mention deals with the impact of hazards associated with device use. Research suggests that the frequency and consequence of hazards resulting from medical device use far exceed those arising from device failures. In other words, bad things happen just by how people improperly use the device. We must first ensure safe and effective device use if all hazards are to be controlled effectively, and we do that through training and applying effective human factors techniques. Now, in terms of the regulatory requirements, as they relate to risk analysis, there are basically three groups of regulatory documents here in the U.S. 21 CFR 820, the Quality System Regulation, which indicates that risk analysis be performed as part of medical devices regulatory submissions, with risk analysis being required as part of design validation. FDA guidance, there are at least two guidance documents that apply, incorporating human factors into risk management and pre-marketing risk assessment. And finally, there's ISO 14971, and that would be version 2007, which is considered the gold standard. It addresses the application of risk management to medical devices and provides or establishes a risk management standard to be applied to medical devices. The ISO document helps manufacturers identify risk and develop, implement, and monitor the effectiveness of their control measures. Now, the ISO document is most precisely a regulatory document concerning risk analysis for medical devices, as I've said. The standard addresses risk management for patients, operators, other parties, other external equipment, and/or the environment. It provides guidance concerning how to manage and control risks associated with your medical device, document your medical device risk management process, apply the risk management process to your medical devices, maintain the risk management process throughout the device's life cycle, verify compliance with the standard, establish a risk management plan for each medical device, and perform a risk analysis for each device. Now, the ISO document provides a way in which a manufacturer can assess risk and make informed decisions. It's important to note that a medical device is not required to be entirely risk-free, nor does the document specify a specific risk acceptance level. The guidance document really leaves that up to you. Now, along with all international performance standards, ISO 14971 is subject to periodic review and update. These revisions are adopted by various countries, but not always at the same time or in the same way. When ISO 14971 is used to meet regulatory requirements, the version to comply with may differ depending on the regulatory regime and potentially the type of medical device that you're hoping to field. It's important to determine which version you must comply with. In determining to use ISO 14971, there may be additional ongoing requirements to comply with or to consider complying with updated revisions. Now, the basic version is formally recognized by the United States Food and Drug Administration. As I said, it's 14971, the 2007 version, and it's recognized, by the United States Food and Drug Administration really as a consensus standard that can be used to support a pre-market application. In markets requiring compliance to European regulations, the version to be used is EN ISO 14971 2012. The main body of the standard is really identical to the 2007 version, but it differs in regard to having informative annexes and some specific issues related to the risk analysis itself. Now, one of the things we need to talk about is really our responsibilities as managers. Now, our responsibilities as it relates to risk analysis. Now, our responsibilities extend to providing evidence to regulatory agencies that the risk analysis requirement is being complied with, providing the necessary resources for execution, testing, and evaluation, and that implies that you have a plan, and institute a policy for identifying, determining, and evaluating risk, periodically assess the effectiveness of the policy, develop a plan that determines how acceptable risk will be determined through this risk management plan. To continue, our responsibilities extend to establishing ranges of risk that are both acceptable and unacceptable for each medical device, and the determination of our risk threshold for each device. The determination of the risks requiring investigation and management review, the establishing a clear definition of risk and its components as contained in engineering standards and as communicated to everyone in the organization. And finally, to organize the risk management team. Now, since I mentioned the risk management team, let's talk a moment about what this team is and what they do. An effective risk management team really is crucial to the effectiveness of your risk management process. Team members must be subject matter experts with a device from the standpoint of construction, operation, manufacturing, and clinical use. They also must be trained in the risk management process, with that expertise being demonstrated through training records and qualification evidence. The expertise possessed by subject matter experts is critical to an effective risk management process. You need that level of skill and knowledge. Now, the center of the risk management process is as I said, the risk management plan. Now, before we talk about the risk management plan, though, let's briefly review some basic tenets of risk assessment that apply to the entire process. First, you cannot eliminate all risk. You therefore must determine your risk threshold. That's the level of risk that the organization is willing to accept for your particular device. You'll not always have all the information you need to fully evaluate your risk. Waiting to gather sufficient information can really lead to greater risk. You assess your risk as you go forward, reassessing as you gather more and more information. Compliance with applicable regulations really is a fundamental requirement as everything that we do in life sciences. Risk principles really don't govern all the regulatory decision making. Now, ISO 14971-2007 lays out the risk management process for the U.S. and is recognized, as I said, by the FDA as a standard. Now, a well-performed risk analysis or evaluation really must show that the alternative chosen, when evaluating mitigating options, best balances harm and benefits based upon what was known at the time that the decision was made. Risk is assessed in the context of the environment of use. In other words, literally, where will the device be used and how will it be used in that environment? You should always consider alternate circumstances that could possibly change the risk profile, such as what is the state of clinical practice? Could changes in medical practice increase the risk with this device? What will be the impact of aging of the device later in the life cycle? We're talking about parts wearing out and maintenance that's required. Now, as we continue talking about this risk management plan, why is it that you think we should have one? Well, it's the risk management plan really is an organized approach. It's crucial for success. The plan provides a sensible, consistent approach to the risk assessment. Risk assessment activities really must be planned and documented. It prevents important elements from really being forgotten, especially as we get in and we move into the life cycle of the device, and how the life cycle of the device will certainly or possibly may alter risk. Verification activities are required, but often don't happen without a plan. The plan provides a formal approach to integrating production and post-production information really into risk management. And the plan specifies the risk assessment activities that must be documented and housed in what we call the risk management file. Now, when considering the content and the areas of risk to be evaluated and addressed in your plan, you need to consider a few things. Number one, the characteristics of the device. Next, the purchasing of component parts. The production process and the hazards that could be introduced into the device as the device is produced and assembled. What could happen during handling and shipping and servicing and inspection. And then we talk about acceptance and how acceptance is going to be evaluated. Now, there are specific documents that are required to support risk management planning. They include the risk management procedure, the risk acceptability criteria, any risk reduction action plans, feedback and corrective action reviews, the design failure mode effects analysis, and risk reviews. Now, all of these documents really must be included in the risk management file. As with common documentation practice, the file doesn't need to physically contain all the documents, but it certainly must contain references to where they are located and can be reviewed. Now, as I've said, risk is managed throughout the entire life cycle of the device. Initially, during design, during the design process, that evaluation is essentially a rough estimation of the risk. As feedback from real users is gathered during the device's life, new and different and certainly unanticipated levels of risk will be exposed. Now, we briefly mentioned the risk management file, but to provide some additional detail, you see here that it's a repository for all the risk management documentation that we've identified. It provides traceability for each identified hazard back to the risk analysis, the risk evaluation, implementation and verification of the risk control measures that were applied, assessment of the acceptability of residual risk. That risk management file can physically, as I said, contain the documents or just simply have or contain a reference to where they can be located. Now, let's look at the risk management process itself. The process really consists of several key steps. The first is to conduct risk management planning, with part of that process being the creation of a policy to determine the organization's risk acceptability criteria. What level of risk is the organization willing to accept? What will they be comfortable with? Next is to actually conduct the risk analysis and evaluate the results. This includes identifying potential hazards with regards to the device and estimating the risk and comparing the estimated risk to the established acceptability criteria. We're going to touch upon this in a couple of slides, but as I indicated, this is simply an overview. That in itself would certainly be a webinar. Next is to implement risk controls required to meet the risk acceptability criteria. So we're talking about what are we going to do to mitigate this risk? I mean, how can we get that risk down to an acceptable to a level that's acceptable or a low level? Next, you must report the status of risk internally and externally. And finally, you need to collect information, both production and post-production, concerning the device that would include reviewing feedback and complaints about that device once that device is released and placed into the field. Now, let me take a moment and clarify what is meant by risk control. Risk control is the process through which decisions are reached and protective measures are implemented for reducing or maintaining risk within the specified risk level. Now, these actions are intended to eliminate or reduce each risk to meet the previously determined risk acceptability criteria. Now, one or more risk control measures may be incorporated during this step. Risk controls may begin as early as design input and continue over the medical device's lifetime. Now, some regulatory schemes prescribe a fixed hierarchy of risk controls that should be examined, such as inherent safety by design, which are the protective measures in the device, and information for safety, which includes such things as warnings, maintenance schedules, etc. Now, throughout the life cycle of the device, it's expected that the manufacturer will monitor whether the risks continue to remain acceptable and whether any new hazards or risks are discovered, particularly as devices begin to wear and require maintenance. Now, key information from production, general complaints, and customer feedback should all be used as part of this monitoring process. Now, that we've talked a little bit about the risk management plan, let's now discuss in a little more detail just how that plan is developed. Now, in terms of ISO 14971, a minimum of requirements for the plan includes the scope of risk management activities, the assigned risk management responsibilities and authorities, the management review requirements, and the established risk acceptability criteria. In terms of the risk acceptability criteria, we're talking about how much risk the organization is willing to accept for the device. That's as I've already explained. This includes the establishment of ranges of risk that are both acceptable and unacceptable and require further investigation, and those requiring management review. Now, these ranges are displayed in a document that we call the Hazard Risk Assessment Matrix. Now, probably the greatest difference between the ISO version 2007 and 2012 lies in this area in terms of how the manufacturer will address risk that they assess. The 2012 version was harmonized. It was meant to harmonize with the medical device directives in the EU. There is currently a new version, 2019, that's currently under development. Now let's take a moment and look at the risk assessment matrix. Now the risk assessment matrix, as you see here, is developed to determine which risks will be addressed by the risk management process. Now shown here is just one example of how one company created their matrix. Now a risk is rated for its probability and severity on a scale to understand where on the risk matrix that particular risk lies. Which risks move forward into the risk management process will depend on the decisions made concerning the risk threshold. Now, some risks by nature are more risk tolerant than others. For example, we can have a device where the team agrees that any risk that is in the red or orange cell can move forward in the risk management process. The rest remain in the watch list and are accepted. Now, in the 2012 version, all risk must be evaluated. Another device, in terms of what we've just indicated, would have a different criteria. Now, these are what you see here depicted are the safety zones. Now, these safety zones represent the combination of severity and probability of harm, and we give them a color code. They identify the residual safety risk for each hazard in order to make a determination of its acceptability. Now, hazards that fall into, in this particular example, safety zone number 1, are considered generally acceptable or minimal and require no further analysis. Additional mitigations are optional for hazards that fall into safety zone green, for example. Hazards that fall into safety zone risk number 2 are considered conditionally acceptable, but require analysis and mitigation. They are considered acceptable only when adequate mitigations are identified, and that would be within the yellow. Hazards that fall into safety risk zone number 3 are generally unacceptable. If hazards in this particular safety zone cannot be further mitigated to the point of falling into an acceptable risk zone, a formal risk-benefit analysis really must be performed and documented, and that would put them into the red. Now, our sample indicated an additional zone shown here as orange and intermittent between 2 and 3, but usually there are these three zones. And as we continue to develop our plan, you need to explain how you plan to collect and review both production and post-production information. So how are you going to collect it and how you're going to evaluate it? You need to describe how verification activities will be accomplished for each of your medical devices. Now, the plan indicates how risk management is accomplished. The repository of the data generated in the risk management file, which we briefly touched upon. Now, we established this file to record, and as I gave you a brief overview prior to this, we established this file to record the risk analysis results for each identified hazard, the risk evaluation results for each identified hazard, the risk control measures employed and the results for each identified hazard, and the residual risk evaluation results for each identified hazard. Now, a word about supplier control. You are really the primary responsible party for risk management with your suppliers. Significant risk always exists as it relates to your suppliers and any changes they make to the components they supply. It assumes that you must have a written change control process agreement with your supplier when changes are made and undertake really a robust analysis of any potential risk to assess the impact of those changes. And obviously you need to assume and you need to have not assume, you need to have a good, strong awareness that your suppliers are working and functioning in accordance with the applicable regulations. Now, when I talk about this supplier control, I like to go back to an example which was some time back, I believe 2 or 3 years, maybe even a little longer than that, and that was with the product Enbrel, which is one of the drugs that's given to patients through an injector. And what had happened was that the manufacturer had utilized a supplier to produce the injector, the medical device itself. And they, in the course of producing this product, and they were well into the life cycle of the product, they decided to make some small, slight changes to a component of the product, and they didn't tell the manufacturer. Apparently, what had happened was that small change that they thought was essentially innocuous turned out to really impact dosage levels that were provided to patients, which would have resulted in a whole host of issues, not to mention some recalls of the device. So supplier controls are quite important. They are an extension of your organization. Now let's review the risk analysis process in just a little bit more detail. Even before a final design has been developed, and again, I'm almost going back here, but I want to go through this in a little more detail after I've provided you with some overview. Now, even before a final design has been developed, a preliminary hazard analysis can be conducted, really, to establish the baseline hazards associated with the device. Now, this analysis consists of listing the major components and operating requirements of the device and evaluating their potential hazards. The components and operating requirements could include raw materials and waste, hardware, monitoring and control systems, human-device interfaces, services, and the operating environment. When conducting a preliminary hazard analysis, you use the what-if or brainstorming approach to really identify the possible failures, evaluate potential consequences, and develop your risk management strategies. Now, at this stage, at this stage in the process, at this stage in development, there's often insufficient detail to evaluate hazard likelihood accurately. However, comparisons may be made with similar devices and their histories, and the medical device reports that accompany them. An evaluation revealing severe hazard potential may really prompt a radical change in your conceptual design. Now, the goal here is to eliminate all high-severity hazards and reduce as many medium and low-severity hazards as possible. There is considerable flexibility at this early design stage to make design changes to mitigate these risks. Now, at this point, major changes can make the device inherently safer, certainly at minimal cost. Now, during prototype development, more detailed hazard and risk analysis can be performed. Now, at this stage of design, at this stage of the design process, the design and mechanical drawings are certainly available, and the basic process operations should be relatively clearly defined. Now, the device and its operation can then be reviewed by a number of analysis techniques, which we'll quickly talk about here in a moment. Now, risk analysis really is an overall, as I said, risk management process that involves the identification of all potential hazards. Now, for each of those hazards, you really must describe what happens or could happen as a result of the hazard occurring. It's not an overly complicated process, other than having to make the identification. Then you must quantify the consequence of the hazard in terms of its severity and frequency of exposure and assign a risk value or level. Now, that risk value is then compared to the company's risk acceptability criteria. If it's too high, the risk needs to be mitigated. Now, this is a quick, just a brief flow chart that I've created to show, very simplified flow chart to show the process. You identify all your hazards. For each of those hazards, you describe the consequences of those hazards, and then you get into that risk estimation and quantification process where it's evaluated. You determine the severity and frequency of exposure. You assign a risk level, and then you compare it to the risk acceptability criteria of your organization, and then it is either acceptable or not acceptable. If it's acceptable, you move on to the next hazard and begin to continue your evaluation. If it is unacceptable, you need to apply mitigation to it, and that's a process unto itself. You need an option analysis and selection, so you've got to determine what those options are, and you have to conduct an analysis and make a selection. You have to implement that. You have to evaluate any residual risk, because we know that once we make a change, that we may introduce additional risk, or there may be risk left over, or some level of risk left over that we have to assess as well. We need to determine that risk-benefit process, and we need to determine certainly any new risks that arise. Now, in terms of determining any new risks that arise, that's often the case in software development. When software changes are made, those changes can create unanticipated issues and other aspects of the software that would create and expose some additional risks. Now, here's an example of what an initial hazard definition might look like. Now, the origins of the inclusion of risk analyses are real incidents of harm to the patients receiving treatment by medical devices, such as electric shocks, overinfusion by infusion pumps, and overdoses of radiation by radiotherapy devices. Now, too many of these incidents really resulted in the deaths of patients, and that would be the center example that we have here that you see. Between June 1985 and January 1987, a computer-controlled radiation therapy machine called the Therac 25 massively overdosed with radiation 6 people. The results were obviously deadly. So if we continue to look at this sample, you see the first one, catheter, that the hazard associated with the catheter would be that it wouldn't be smooth, it would have burrs. What would be the consequences of the situation where it would that burred tip would tear the vessel wall? The result would be vessel trauma. We skip over the second one, which we've already mentioned, and we get to the third. A catheter might not be sterile. There's a potential exposure to infection, and the result would be severe illness or death. So that's the level of description that we need to apply. Now, as you saw partly in the previous slide graphic during the risk analysis, you really must describe the device being analyzed. You need to describe its intended purpose. You need to determine the scope of the analysis. Is it broad, as would be required for a totally brand new device, or is it narrow, as would be required if we're making a design change, really, to an existing device? You would need to define the device's characteristics. Then, as you get into the analysis, you really must identify the hazards and evaluate the risks. Now, all of these risk analysis actions are documented and included where in the risk management file. Now, some potential hazards that may need to be evaluated include such things as toxicity, flammability, and reactivity of raw materials and waste, sensitivity to environmental factors such as temperature and humidity, mechanical or electronic hazards, and human factors associated with the operator-device interface. The patient-device interface can also be hazardous because of unsafe or ineffective delivery of energy, administration of drugs, or control of life-sustaining functions. The very first drug devices, the drug dispensing devices that you see in the hospital that were created many years ago, did not have or didn't have sufficient controls in place to prevent the patient from overdosing themselves. So that patient interface had to be certainly beefed up to prevent that from happening. Also, incorrect information could lead to a misdiagnosis or a wrong treatment or therapy being ordered in the case of a diagnostic test. So we're looking at device or component failures, and here they are summarized: chemical, mechanical, thermal, electrical, radiation, biological, software, and labeling. So those are essentially the hazards in a bucket that we would be dealing with. Now, user-related hazards include: is the device used in ways that were not anticipated? Is the device used in ways that are anticipated but inadequately controlled? Does the device require physical, perceptual, or cognitive abilities that really exceed those of the end user? In other words, is the device too complicated to use? Is the device use inconsistent with inconsistent with users' expectations or intuition about device operation? And does the user environment affect device operation, the effect not understood by the user? Are they using it in an area that's too high in humidity if the device is humidity sensitive, for example? Now, when we talk about these particular types of human factors engineering hazards, that leads me to an example of a situation that happened many years ago with some of the first ventilators. Some of the first ventilators were implemented and fielded in a hospital, and the first thing that happened over the course of several weeks, there were several deaths of patients that were on the ventilator, and it really became quite difficult to determine what the root cause of that was. Eventually, they found out, and it was a simple root cause that led to really a deadly result. Essentially what happened was because of the limited non-dedicated electrical outlets in the room, when the cleaning individual came into the room to buff the floor, they went over to the outlet, and the only outlet that was available was plugged in. They unplugged it. They plugged their buffer into the wall, did the buffing, and replugged the ventilator plug back into the wall. Unfortunately, what happened in the period of time that device was unplugged, the patient expired. So essentially what happened is that once that root cause was determined, the manufacturer then obviously instituted a battery backup system for the ventilator. So let's talk about go on to discuss some of the aspects of the ISO document, which we know is the standard. Now, ISO 14971, the Annex C of that contains an extensive list of potential questions. For example, will the device be implemented? Will the device be in contact with patient or other people? How is the device sterilized? Will the device be routinely cleaned? I mean, there are many levels of questions that are asked that the manufacturer is expected to be able to answer and answer as part of the process. Now, the use of these questions really should be the starting point for your risk analysis to identify the characteristics of the device that may impact on safety as expected by the standard. As well as answering the Annex C questions, you must in the EU, but you could incorporate some questions around the design process and how failures in the design process could impact patient safety or produce other harms. Now, for the questions requiring new manufacturing processes to be explained, this can be expanded, again, optional here, required there in the EU, expanded by adding questions about how manufacturing processes and failures could lead to patient or other harms. Now, a question on packaging could be included as there is not a specific one listed. A separate study could also be performed on design, manufacture, and packaging instead of adding. I'm sorry, I got confused there. Now, what we're saying is that instead of adding these separate questions, instead of adding a series of questions that you can answer for some of these things, if we're talking about the EU, what you would do is to simply conduct a separate study that would be performed on the design, manufacture, and packaging instead of simply adding these questions, and that would be an acceptable approach. That approach would be conducted using, for example, the failure mode and effects analysis. Now, if FMEAs are performed, you need to ensure that any residual risks found are transferred to the main risk table and are evaluated in the same manner as the other risks. Again, that level is optional. Here is required in the EU under version 2012. Now, to this point, we've talked about the development of the risk analysis plan. We've talked about all aspects of that. Now, I just want to quickly look at the analysis tools that are available and used. Pretty much these you're going to be familiar with. Now, there are three basic tools and a few others as well. The fault tree analysis, the FMEA, and the FMECA. A hazard and operability analysis, a HAZOP, is another one. That study is a bottom-up approach that's ideal for new or complex designs involving a number of processing steps. Now, a HAZOP is conducted on individual steps, each of which has a design intent. Now, a fault tree analysis is an effective top-down approach. The team starts with the undesired consequence or top event and identifies the initiating and contributing events that really must occur to produce it. Now, these events are combined using what we call logic gates. Now, a logic gate, as you see in the illustration, is the point at which two or more independent events are combined in order to produce a higher level event. That would be the small illustration at the bottom. If all events under a gate are necessary for a higher event to occur, what we call an AND, A-N-D gate is used. Each of these gates is sufficient to produce, each of these events really is sufficient to produce the higher event on its own, or an OR gate is used. Both mechanical failures and human errors can readily be included in a fault tree. Now, when a device contains many mechanical components, an FMEA should be considered. However, an FMEA is time-consuming and generally applied only to Class 3 devices or to the safety critical portions of devices. Now, for those devices that contain many electrical components, an FMEA is also recommended. Contains several headings. You have the function or component that would be listed. The failure would be the loss of a function under the stated conditions. The failure mode describes the way the failure occurs. The failure cause and our mechanism really addresses the defects in requirements, design, process, quality control, handling, or part application, which are the underlying cause or sequence of causes that initiate a process that leads to a failure mode over time. The failure effect, which is the immediate consequences of a failure on the device's operation, function, or functionality, or the status of some item. The specific hazard, what is the harm resulting from the failure, and the risk index, which you don't see here in this one. The RPN is a measure used when assessing risk to really help identify critical failure modes associated with your design or process. Now, the FMECA is an improved version of the FMEA, and by adding a criticality section that includes the probability of occurrence and the severity of failure. Now, again, that's about as far as the level of detail we're going to go through on there, because what we're talking about here is an overview. But that's basically the tools that we've talked about. Now, in terms of implementing an FMEA, when should you use that? At the start of each design step. Remember our design flow that we talked about earlier. At each design review, throughout the life cycle of the device. Now, the types of FMEAs that we showed you, the design FMEA, it focuses on the weaknesses in the design, the failures during manufacturing when fielded with the product. A process FMEA focuses on the reasons for potential failures. Now, we'll finish our webinar by talking about some risk control mitigation. Now, once the risk has been evaluated, obviously it must be mitigated. How are we going to reduce this risk? How are we going to eliminate or control it? And what options do we have? What are the options that we have available to us, or what are the control measures? Can the risk be reduced? Can it be controlled? Redesign, are we talking about redesign, which would eliminate the risk? Are we talking about control, which would be measures such as alarms and guards and safety devices and placards? Are we talking about user information, which would be training and, again, placards? The implemented control measures really, when we implement these control measures, when we put them in place, we must evaluate them for effectiveness and also to make sure that they have not created some additional risk. And the final design really must indicate that risk control certainly has been verified. Now, let me talk a few minutes about, as we end up here, about residual risk. Now, because risk cannot be completely eliminated, the risk that remains must be managed. And what do we call that? We call that residual risk. Now, to manage this residual risk, you really must first evaluate the risk that remains. You can't eliminate all risk. Remember, we said that at the beginning. You need to ask if it's acceptable. And again, that's a major difference between the U.S. version of the ISO document and the EU version. They don't use the term acceptable, they use the term low. So they ask if it's acceptable. Can it be mitigated in some way? Next, you conduct a risk-benefit analysis. Is it worth the risk to not further mitigate the risk if further mitigation is not possible or feasible? The difference between U.S. and the EU is that in the EU they've taken all economic or monetary considerations out of this risk-benefit analysis because they don't want that to be an influence on whether or not a mitigation option or a mitigating action is not taken. Now, have any new risks occurred from any mitigation or redesign efforts? So we always have to look at that. And finally, we need to document those risks that don't exist to really ensure thoroughness. Now, because risk cannot be completely eliminated, this remaining risk must be managed. Once you get to that point, you execute this management by developing written definitions of what needs to be done and how to do it. You need to define responsibilities and accountability. You need to define what needs authorization and who is responsible for handling it. To define the skills and knowledge necessary to implement the system and provide a provision for training those who don't possess those particular skills. You must develop and maintain written documentation to demonstrate conformance to policies and procedures. You must incorporate measures to cross-check and verify that procedures are followed. And finally, you need to verify that systems are in place and are functioning properly. Now, we'll end by talking briefly about the risk management report. You really must create a document that represents or presents evidence that the risk management plan has been fulfilled and implemented. It must specify if residual risk is acceptable. It must explain the methods to obtain relevant production, post-production information, such as performance during production and post-production phases, installation, use, and maintenance. You need to review publicly available information, any new or to uncover any new or not considered unconsidered risk. The document must be developed prior to the distribution of the device, and the document must be reviewed by key design and development staff. Now, the key to successful risk management in medical device design really is to start early. As soon as conceptual designs are available, the risk management process can start. A preliminary hazard analysis can be useful in selecting the concept design with the highest level of inherent safety. Later, as the design is developed, design reviews at key points in the development process will allow changes to be made without significantly affecting the project schedule. Risk management activities will identify opportunities to improve device performance. The benefits of conducting risk analysis during medical device design really can be significant and can be used to offset some or all of the cost of implementing risk mitigating measures. Now, there's always a trade-off in how to manage risk. Hardware or software controls are generally viewed really as more effective since they're more reliable than humans. However, since there is a need for human interaction in the operation of all medical devices, the element of risk needs to be adequately evaluated. Minimizing the level of routine human intervention will certainly reduce risk and improve efficiency. Now, on that note, that completes and ends our webinar today, and I'll turn it over to Vicki to certainly moderate any Q&A that you might have. Again, if I'll try to answer any questions that you have. If I can't answer them, I'll just take your information and I'll certainly get back to you. And again, I've tried to address and look at some of the quick differences between the 2012 version of the ISO document as opposed to the 2007. But there are many more that need to be covered as well. But so that's it, Vicki. I'll ask you to moderate the Q&A at this point.